Another difference between member functions and non-member functions is how they are called or invoked in the main routine. Let's consider the following segment of code where we have a main routine here. Then we have 3 variables declared. Like any normal variable we have seen before, we have an integer I declared. We simply say the data type followed by the variable name. And the same goes when we want to declare an object of student class or declare an instance of student struct. We simply say student class stu_c and then student struct stu_s. The data type followed by the name of your variable. Now when we declare an object of student class, remember that a constructor is called. Remember that a special initializer function gets called when this object is created. That's called a constructor. And if we were to look at the .cpp file of the class, if I asked you what 2 things identify a constructor, remember that the constructor function has the same name as the class and it has no return type. Now specifically here when we say student class stu_c semicolon, this calls the default constructor. That's a constructor with no parameters. And the default constructor is automatically created by the compiler unless you define a constructor. Even if you define one constructor and you do not define the default constructor, the compiler will expect you to create the default constructor in that scenario. And we'll see that in more detail later on. So I have an object of student class and an instance of student struct. They are declared very similarly. The one interesting part is that when you declare a student class object, you are going to call either the default constructor or a constructor based on what parameters you are passing. Now, again, the difference between a member function and a non-member function is how they are called in the main routine. So, if I want to invoke a member function, first I take the object of student class, stu_c, and I put it on the outside and I use the dot notation, and then I write the member function name. stu_c is going to be called the invoker in this case because it is invoking the printall function for the stu_c object. For a non-member function, you simply write the function name and you pass it any parameters that it takes. This is like any other function call that we've seen up until this point. So recall that dot notation is used for an instance of a class to call the member functions of the class. And then regarding structures, dot notation is used to access the data for the structure. And we'll see that in further detail later. But I just want to emphasize that point. Notice how the member function uses dot notation and the non-member function does not. So here you can tell the difference between a member function and a non-member function based on how they are called in the main routine.